Right after my father's funeral, my daughter let out a cold little laugh and said, "Do you really think you can fight us with that poor unknown lawyer?" Her husband laughed along with her like I was too old, too broke, and too foolish to understand the game they were playing. I said nothing. I simply looked down at the sealed envelope in my hand. Because earlier that morning, that old lawyer had looked me straight in the eye and said something that sent a chill down my spine. You chose to stay, and I don't take that lightly. Drop a comment below. Just tell me where in the world you're watching from. Your city, your country, anything. It means more than you know. Subscribe if this is your kind of story. Quick note: this story includes fictional elements crafted for entertainment and educational purposes. Similarities to any names or places are coincidental, but the lesson inside is absolutely worth your attention. My father and I had a ritual that lasted 23 years without a single interruption. Every morning, somewhere between 6:15 and 6:30, I called him. Didn't matter if it was a Tuesday or a holiday or the middle of a snowstorm. I called, he answered, and we talked about nothing important. The news, his garden, whether the Panthers had any shot at a decent season. Those calls never lasted more than 10 minutes, but they were hours and neither of us ever missed one. Until the last week of June. The first morning he didn't answer. I told myself he was in the bathroom. Called back 20 minutes later. Nothing. I figured he'd fallen asleep in his chair again. He did that sometimes, nodded off, with the television going, and didn't hear the phone. By the third call, I wasn't figuring anything anymore. I was just sitting in my kitchen with a cold cup of coffee, staring at the wall. When Gloria picked up on the fourth try, her voice was smooth as Sunday morning. "Ray Daddy's resting. You know how he gets." "He doesn't get like this," I said. "We talk every day, Gloria?" "Well, he asked not to be disturbed. I'm just respecting his wishes." Something in her tone made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Not what she said, it was the way she said it. Calm, rehearsed, like she'd been waiting for this exact conversation. I let it go that first day, and the second. But by the fourth morning, when she picked up again before the second ring, I knew she was sitting right next to that phone, waiting for it. "He's sleeping, Raymond." "It's 6:20 in the morning, Gloria. He's been up since 5 his whole life. People change when they get older. He's 82, not 100. Put him on." "I told you he doesn't want to be bothered." I hung up. Then I got in my car. The drive to my father's house on Farmingdale Road took 11 minutes. I made it in 8. When I pulled up, Gloria's car was already in the driveway, which told me she hadn't just stopped by. She was living there, or close enough to it. I knocked. She opened the door before my knuckles finished the second knock, which told me she'd seen me coming. "Ray." She stood square in the doorway, arms loose at her sides, like a woman who had every right to be standing exactly where she was. "He's resting." "I'd like to hear that from him. He's not up for company right now." "I'm not company, Gloria. I'm his son." She didn't move, didn't flinch, just looked at me with those flat, patient eyes and said, "He asked for quiet. I'm giving him quiet. You should, too." I looked past her shoulder into the living room. The television was off. The reading lamp by his chair was on. And there in that old brown recliner he'd had since before I was married, sat my father. He was awake, eyes open, hands folded in his lap, looking straight at the window, at me. "Pop," I said it before I could stop myself. His head turned, slow like a man moving through water, and when his eyes found mine through the glass, something crossed his face that I hadn't seen there in years. Not confusion, not pain, recognition and relief. He lifted one hand off his lap, just barely. A small, quiet gesture, the kind you make when you want someone to know you see them without drawing attention to yourself. His mouth moved. I couldn't hear the words through the glass. But I know my father's face. I've known it my whole life. And what I saw in it right then wasn't a man who wanted to be left alone. Gloria stepped to the side, just slightly, just enough to block my line of sight. And then she reached out and pulled the curtain closed. I stood on that porch for a long moment. The neighborhood was quiet around me. Birds doing their morning thing, somebody's sprinkler clicking in the distance. Everything normal. Everything wrong. She opened the door again, just enough to look at me. "He needs his rest, Ray. I'll tell him you stopped by." I walked back to my car. I sat in it for close to 15 minutes, hands on the wheel, not going anywhere. 6 months before that morning, my father had called me out of nowhere on a Sunday afternoon. Not our usual time, not our usual rhythm. Just rang, and when I picked up, he was quiet for a second before he said what he'd called to say. "Son, I need you to remember something." Okay, Pop, I'm listening. If anything ever happens to me, and I mean anything, any kind of trouble, after I'm gone, you go see Arthur Browne. You hear me? Don't talk to anybody else first. You go straight to Arthur. Arthur Browne. I knew the name vaguely, an old man with a small law office somewhere on Beatty's Ford Road. My father had mentioned him over the years the way you mention someone you trust completely but rarely have to think about. My lawyer, is how he always said it with a quiet certainty that meant the conversation was over. Pop, why are you telling me this right now? He was quiet again, then because I want to make sure you remember it. That's all. You'll know when the time comes. I'd thought about that call maybe twice since then, chalked it up to an old man being careful. Maybe he'd updated his will, maybe he'd done some estate planning and wanted me to know who to call. Sitting in my car outside his house that June morning, watching that closed curtain, I thought about it for the third time. And for the first time I understood why he'd said it. I didn't know yet what was inside that house. Didn't know about any documents or any plans, or any of the things that were already in motion behind that closed curtain. All I knew was that my father had looked at me through that glass, like a man who had something to say, and no way left to say it. I started the car. I pulled away from the curb, and I told myself that whatever was happening in that house, I was going to find out. Not because I was angry, though I was. Not because I felt cheated, though something in my chest felt like a bruise already forming. But because that man in the brown recliner had lifted his hand to show me he still knew I was there, and I was not going to let that be the last thing he ever got to tell me. The call came at 5:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was already awake, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee I hadn't touched, staring at my phone the way a man stares at something he's both waiting for and dreading. 9 days had passed since I'd stood on my father's porch and watched that curtain fall closed. 9 days of Gloria picking up his phone, 9 days of the same smooth excuses, 9 days of me driving past his house at odd hours just to see the lights on and tell myself he was still okay. When her name came up on my screen that Tuesday morning, my stomach dropped before I even answered. Raymond. Her voice was flat, not broken, not trembling. Flat? Daddy passed about an hour ago, peaceful, in his sleep. I sat there with the phone against my ear and didn't say anything for a long moment. Ray, you hear me? I heard you. My own voice came out strange to me, lower than usual, like it was coming from somewhere far away. I'm on my way. I was in my car in 4 minutes. I don't remember putting on shoes. The drive to Farmingdale Road felt both too long and too short. I kept thinking about that hand he'd raised toward the window, that quiet, deliberate wave. I kept thinking about how I'd driven away, how I'd told myself I'd figure it out, that there was time, that I'd get back to him. I pulled onto a street and knew immediately that something was wrong. There was a car in my father's driveway that I didn't recognize. Dark gray, clean, expensive, not a neighbor's vehicle, not family. I parked behind it and walked to the front door, and before I even knocked, I could hear voices inside. Professional voices. The kind people use when they're working. Gloria opened the door. She was dressed already, not in the clothes of a woman who'd been up all night grieving. Hair done, lipstick on a silk blouse I'd never seen before. The funeral home is on their way, she said, stepping aside just enough to let me see into the front hallway, but not far enough to actually let me in. There are some documents that need to be handled first. Documents. I looked past her. In my father's living room, two people I had never seen before were moving around his desk, opening drawers, stacking papers. One of them, a man in a navy suit, gray at the temples, maybe 50 years old, was holding a folder and speaking quietly to the other. He didn't look up when I appeared at the door. He was too focused on what he was doing. Who are those people? I asked. They're handling the estate paperwork, Gloria said. It's what Daddy wanted. He's been gone for an hour, and there are strangers going through his desk. Raymond, whose attorneys are they? Gloria, Vanessa's? She didn't answer right away, and that half-second of silence told me everything. There's a process, she said finally. Legal matters don't wait even when... Get them out of his house. My voice stayed even, but just barely. He is not even cold, and there are people rifling through his things. You don't have standing to make that call. Standing. She used the word standing. My father was lying somewhere in the back of that house, and my sister was talking to me about legal standing at 6 in the morning. I took one step back from the door, not because I was backing down, because I needed to think, and I couldn't think with rage filling up my chest like floodwater. I looked once more at the man in the navy suit. He had turned slightly, and for just a moment our eyes met through the doorway. He didn't react, didn't acknowledge me at all. Just turned back to the folder in his hands with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this before and expected no interruptions. Gloria began to close the door. "I'll be in touch," she said. The door clicked shut. I stood on that porch for a moment, my hand still half raised, as if I'd been about to push my way in. The morning was quiet around me. A mockingbird somewhere in the oak tree across the street was running through its whole repertoire, completely indifferent to what was happening on this porch. My father's words came back to me then, not the last time I'd seen him through a window, but 6 months before that, on a regular Sunday afternoon, when he'd called me out of nowhere and said what he needed to say. "Arthur Browne." I pulled out my phone. I still had the number in my contacts, added it the same afternoon Pop had mentioned him, more out of habit than any real sense of urgency. I'd never called it. I found it now and pressed dial. It rang twice. "Raymond Calloway." Arthur Browne's voice was steady and unhurried, the voice of a man in his 70s who had stopped being surprised by things a long time ago. "I've been expecting to hear from you." That stopped me cold. "You knew." "I heard this morning. I'm sorry about your father, son. Harold was a good man, one of the best I knew." "Arthur, there are people in his house right now, going through his desk. I don't know who they are, but I think they work for Vanessa." "I figured something like that would happen fast," he said. "Listen to me carefully, Ray. Do not sign anything today. Do not agree to anything. Do not acknowledge any document anyone puts in front of you. Not today, not this week. You understand? What is going on? Come to my office this afternoon, 2 o'clock. I have something your father left with me, something he asked me to hold until it was needed." He paused. "Ray, your father was a careful man. He didn't leave things to chance. What's happening in that house right now, he saw it coming, and he made sure there was a way to answer it." I looked back at the closed front door of the house I'd grown up in. 2 o'clock, I said. 2 o'clock, Arthur confirmed. "And Ray, don't go back inside today. Let them think they have a head start. It won't matter." I put the phone in my pocket and stood there another moment, looking at that door. Somewhere inside, my father lay still for the first time in 82 years. Somewhere inside, a man in a navy suit was going through his papers like it was just another Tuesday. I turned and walked back to my car. I didn't know yet what Arthur was holding for me. Didn't know what my father had planned or how far back the planning went. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty as I pulled away from Farmingdale Road for the second time in 9 days. The man in the navy suit had made a mistake by not looking up from that folder, because I'd seen his face, and I wasn't going to forget it. Arthur Browne's office sat on the second floor of a brick building on Beatty's Ford Road that looked like it hadn't changed since 1987. The elevator was broken, so I took the stairs. The hallway smelled like old paper and wood polish, and there was a handwritten sign on his door that just said, "A. Browne, Attorney at Law," in letters that had faded to almost nothing. I knocked. He opened it himself. He was a tall man, lean in the way that comes from decades rather than discipline, with white hair cropped close, and eyes that were sharp in a way his age hadn't touched. He shook my hand with a firm, deliberate grip, the kind that tells you a person means what they do, and stepped aside to let me in. "I'm sorry about your father, Ray," he said. "Sit down. We have a lot to cover." The office was small and cluttered with a kind of organized chaos, stacks of folders, shelves of legal volumes, a desk buried under papers, with a clear path right down the middle, like a man who knew exactly where everything was. On one corner of the desk, set apart from everything else, was a white envelope, sealed. My name wasn't on it. Nothing was. I sat. Arthur settled into his chair across from me, folded his hands, and started from the beginning. "Your father and I go back 20 years, he said. "I drafted his original will in 2010, updated it in 2019. I know what he wanted because he told me himself more than once in this exact room." He paused. "Under that, will the one Harold signed and dated, and was of completely sound mind when he signed the estate breaks down like this. You receive 55%. Vanessa receives 30. Gloria receives 15. I absorbed that, and the total, roughly $875,000 between the house on Farmingdale, a parcel of land outside the city savings, and his life insurance policy." I nodded slowly. My father had built that over 60 years of careful, quiet work, every dollar accounted for. Now, Arthur said, and his voice shifted just slightly, not harder, but more deliberate. 2 weeks ago, a document surfaced. It's called a codicil. You know the term. Vaguely. A codicil is a legal amendment to an existing will. Instead of rewriting the whole document, you attach a codicil that overrides specific provisions. It's perfectly legal when it's executed properly. He let that last part land before continuing. This codicil was signed on June 18th, 17 days before your father passed. June 18th. I counted backward in my head. That was right in the middle of the period when Gloria had started intercepting my calls, when I couldn't get through to my father no matter how many times I tried. What does it say? I asked. It reverses the distribution almost entirely. Under this codicil, Vanessa receives 70%. You receive 20. Gloria receives 10. The room was quiet for a moment. That's not what he wanted, I said. Not angry, not loud, just certain. I believe you're right, Arthur said. And here's why this matters legally. For a codicil to be valid in North Carolina, 2 conditions must be met. First, the person signing it must have what's called testamentary capacity, meaning they fully understand what they own, who their family is, and what the document does. Second, the signature must be given freely without anyone pressuring or manipulating them into it. He leaned forward slightly. If either of those conditions is compromised, the codicil can be challenged and thrown out. And you think one of them was compromised? I think both of them may have been. But thinking isn't enough. We need evidence. He reached across the desk and picked up the white envelope. Which is why your father came to see me 2 years ago. He set it down in front of me. Up close, I could see the seal was notarized a small, embossed stamp in the corner, the kind a certified notary presses into paper to make a document official. In Harold's own handwriting, across the front, 4 words, open only if contested. He sat in that chair where you're sitting now, Arthur said quietly. He told me he had a feeling, not a certainty, just a feeling that someone in the family might try to alter things after he was gone. He said he wanted to leave something behind that could speak for him, if he couldn't speak for himself. Arthur's voice was steady, but I could hear the weight underneath it. So he prepared a sealed, notarized affidavit, a signed legal statement witnessed and certified by a notary, public independent of our office, confirming his true wishes and his observations about certain family dynamics. That affidavit was then registered with Mecklenburg County Probate Court under a specific file number. The court has its own record of this envelope's existence. It cannot be disputed or dismissed. I stared at the envelope, my father's handwriting. Careful, deliberate letters, the same hand that had signed my birthday cards and written me notes in my lunchbox when I was 7 years old. He registered it with the court 2 years ago, I said. Correct. Which means he'd been thinking about this for 2 years, at least. Arthur's expression was gentle but grave. Ray, your father, loved his family, but he was also a realist. He knew his children, and he knew his grandchildren, and he made sure that when the time came, the truth would have somewhere to stand. I sat back in my chair. The afternoon light was coming through the blinds in thin strips across the floor, and I could hear the distant sound of traffic on Beatty's Ford Road below us. Can I open it now? I asked. Not yet. Only when there's a formal legal contest, when this goes in front of a judge. Opening it prematurely could give opposing counsel grounds to challenge its integrity. He folded his hands again. But the time for that may come sooner than you think. Vanessa's attorneys filed the codicil 4 days after Harold passed. That's unusually fast, Ray. Standard processing in this county takes 2 to 3 weeks. 4 days. They'd had that document ready and waiting. Arthur, I said, what do we do? He looked at me across the desk with the calm certainty of a man who had been waiting for exactly this question. First, he said, you tell me everything that happened in the last 3 weeks. Every phone call Gloria didn't put through. Every time you tried to see your father and couldn't. Every detail. He picked up a legal pad. We're going to build something, Ray. One detail at a time. And when we walk into that courtroom, your father is going to be in that room with us. He clicked his pen. Start from the beginning. 3 weeks after we buried my father, I was in the middle of making a sandwich when I heard a car pull into my driveway. I didn't recognize the sound of the engine. At first, it was too clean, too new. I looked out the kitchen window and saw a white SUV I'd never seen before parked behind my truck. Vanessa was already halfway up the front walk before I made it to the door. She looked good. That was the first thing I noticed, and I hated myself a little for noticing it. Hair done heels on a Tuesday morning, a blazer that probably cost more than my monthly utilities. She was carrying a leather portfolio under one arm and wearing the particular expression I'd seen on her face since she was 16 years old, the one that meant she'd already decided how a conversation was going to go. "Daddy," she said it warmly, stepped forward and hugged me before I could say anything. The hug lasted exactly as long as it needed to and no longer. "Can I come in? I won't take much of your time." I stepped back and let her in. She sat at my kitchen table like she'd sat there 100 times before because she had. This was the table where she'd done her homework, where we'd eaten Christmas breakfast, where I'd helped her practice for her college interviews. Watching her set that leather portfolio on it felt like something I couldn't name. I know this is a hard time," she started, and her voice was soft, careful, the voice of someone who has rehearsed their opening. "For all of us. Losing Grandpa, Harold." "Vanessa." I sat down across from her. "What did you bring?" She held my gaze for a moment, then opened the portfolio. She slid a document across the table, clean pages professionally formatted, multiple signature lines flagged with small adhesive tabs. "It's called a disclaimer of inheritance," she said. "Basically, it's a legal document where you formally decline your portion of the estate. It simplifies things, Daddy, avoids a long probate process, keeps the family out of court, lets everyone move forward." She folded her hands on the table. "Grandpa's most recent document already outlines how things should be divided. This just makes it official and clean." I didn't touch the document. I looked at her. "His most recent document," I said. "The codicil, yes. It reflects what he wanted at the end. The law recognizes the most recently executed document. That's just how it works. And you're asking me to sign away my portion based on a document that appeared 17 days before he died." Something shifted in her expression just slightly, just for a second. Then the smoothness came back. "Grandpa had time to think, Daddy. He made his wishes clear." I reached across the table and picked up the disclaimer. Not to read it, to look at the bottom of the last page. Arthur had told me sitting in that office on Beatty's Ford Road to notice everything. Look at everything. Date stamps, filing marks, document metadata. So I looked. In the lower right corner of the final page, almost invisible in a small gray font, was the print date. June 28th. Harold Calloway was alive on June 28th. Weak, yes. Isolated, yes. But alive. And on that same day, someone had already printed a disclaimer of inheritance with my name on the signature line. I set the document back down on the table. "When was this printed, Vanessa?" She blinked. "What?" I turned it around and pointed to the corner. "June 28th. Your grandfather was still alive." For 3 full seconds, she didn't say anything. I watched her process it, watched her decide how to respond. "That's just when the template was prepared," she said. "Attorneys do that in advance. It's standard practice." "Standard practice," I repeated, "to prepare a document asking me to give up my inheritance before the man leaving it to me had actually passed." "Daddy, you're reading too much into a date stamp." "Vanessa," I kept my voice level, "who printed this?" "My attorneys." "And who told your attorneys to print it on June 28th? Her jaw tightened, just barely. "I'm not going to sit here and be cross-examined in your kitchen." "I'm not cross-examining you. I'm asking you a question." She gathered the document from the table and slid it back into the portfolio, with the controlled precision of a person who is angry and refusing to show it. She stood up, smoothed her blazer, and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face since she was a teenager. That particular blend of frustration and calculation that meant she was recalibrating. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," she said. "Maybe so." I stood too. "But I'm not signing anything today." She nodded once, not agreeing, just acknowledging, and walked toward the front door. I followed. As she stepped onto the porch, I looked past her at the white SUV in my driveway. There was someone in the passenger seat. A man. He was looking down at a phone, but as Vanessa came down the front steps, he looked up. We made eye contact for less than 2 seconds before he looked away. I'd never seen him before, but something about the way he was watching the house, not casually, not the way a man waits while his wife runs an errand, made my chest tighten. "Vanessa." She stopped at the bottom of the steps and turned. "Who's in the car?" "My husband." she said like the question barely deserved an answer. She walked to the SUV and got in. The engine started. They backed out of my driveway and were gone. I stood on my porch for a long moment after they left. The portfolio was gone, the document was gone, and Vanessa was gone. But the date in that lower right corner was still with me, clear as anything. June 28th. Somebody had been very sure on June 28th that Ray Calloway was going to need to be asked to give something up. The only question eating at me now was how long before that date they'd started being sure, and what exactly they'd done to make themselves feel that way. Arthur had told me to write everything down, not because he thought I'd forget, but because feelings don't hold up in a courtroom. Dates do. Times do. A spiral notebook with entries written in the moment in your own handwriting, with specific details that only someone who was actually there would know that holds up. So I bought a notebook, black cover, college ruled. I kept it on the kitchen counter next to my coffee maker, and every morning I wrote down anything that felt worth recording. It started small. A missed call from Gloria, a neighbor mentioning they'd seen an unfamiliar car on Farmingdale Road. Small things that might mean nothing, or might mean everything. 7 days after Vanessa had sat at my kitchen table with that portfolio, I found the envelope. It was wedged under my front door, not in the mailbox, not on the porch, but pushed through the gap at the bottom of the door far enough that it was halfway across my entryway floor. Plain white. No stamp, no return address, nothing written on the outside. I picked it up the way you pick up something you already don't want to touch. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded once. 2 words handwritten in block letters pressed hard enough into the page that the pen had almost gone through. Sign it. I stood in my entryway for a long moment, looking at those 2 words. Then I did what Arthur had told me to do. I went to the kitchen, got a freezer bag, put the note inside without folding it again, wrote the date and time on the outside in marker August 12th, 7:14 in the morning, and set it on the counter next to my notebook. Then I sat down and wrote everything in the notebook. What the envelope looked like, where exactly it was on the floor, what the handwriting looked like, block letters pressed hard slightly, uneven, on the I and sign like whoever wrote it was in a hurry or angry or both. The calls started 2 days later, 4 of them over the course of a week, always from the same number, a string of digits I didn't recognize, no area code I could place. I answered the first one expecting a telemarketer. There was nothing on the other end. Not silence exactly, more like the particular quality of quiet you get when someone is there but choosing not to speak. Breathing maybe, or just the ambient sound of a room. I stayed on the line for 10 seconds. Then I hung up and immediately wrote down the number, the time, and the duration. I answered the second call the same way. Same quiet. Same 10 seconds. After that, I stopped answering and just let them go to voicemail. They never left a message, but I logged every single one: date, time, duration of the ring number. Called from. 4 calls in 8 days. A pattern that didn't feel random. The stranger showed up on a Thursday evening. I noticed the car first, a dark blue sedan parked on the opposite side of the street, 2 houses down. Nothing remarkable about it except that it was there when I got home at 6, and still there at 8:15 when I took out the trash. I didn't approach it. Didn't write down the plate number in any obvious way. I went inside, got my phone, took a photo through the gap in my living room curtains. Then I went and sat at my kitchen table and tried to read a book for 20 minutes, while my mind did anything but. At 8:45 I checked again. The car was gone. I called Arthur the next morning. An envelope under the door, he said when I'd finished laying it all out. Phone calls with no one on the line. Someone sitting outside your house for 2 hours. Could be nothing. I said not because I believed it, but because I wanted to hear him say otherwise. Could be, he said, but you did the right thing logging it all. Keep doing that. Every single detail, Ray. Don't confront anyone, don't respond to anything, don't change your routine. You understand, let them show you who they are. Arthur, is this coming from Vanessa, or someone else? He was quiet for a moment. I don't know yet, but scared people rarely work alone. And whoever is doing this, they're scared. That's worth remembering. That was on a Friday. On Saturday afternoon, Vanessa called. She opened with small talk, asked how I was holding up, mentioned the weather, said she'd been thinking about me. It was 3 minutes of careful warmth before she got to what she'd actually called to say. I heard you went to see Arthur Browne. she said. Who told you that? It doesn't matter. Daddy, I just want you to understand something. Her tone shifted, still smooth, but with something harder underneath it now, like a stone wrapped in fabric. Arthur Browne is 72 years old. He works out of a two-room office that he's been in since before you and I were born. He hasn't tried a real contested case in over a decade. She paused. He can't help you, and I worry that he's going to give you hope that leads you somewhere painful. I let her finish. Vanessa, I said, how do you know where Arthur Browne's office is? A beat of silence. I looked him up. You looked him up. I kept my voice even. Why would you look up your grandfather's personal attorney unless you already knew he was relevant to something, Raymond? He's been Pop's lawyer for 20 years, Vanessa. His name isn't on any public document related to this estate. The only way you'd know to look him up is if you already knew he might be a problem for you. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice had dropped the warmth entirely. I'm trying to help you avoid a long, expensive process that you're not going to win. I'm trying to protect what's left of this family. And if you choose to spend whatever inheritance you might have on legal fees, chasing something that isn't there, that's your decision. But don't say I didn't try. She hung up before I could respond. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long moment. Then I went to my desk drawer, where I kept cards and receipts and small pieces of paper I hadn't thrown away yet. I found what I was looking for near the bottom, a birthday card Vanessa had given me last year. Inside, in her handwriting, a few lines she'd written herself. I carried it back to the kitchen table. I set it next to the freezer bag with the sign IT note. I positioned them side by side under the overhead light and looked at the two sets of handwriting. Block letters on the note. Cursive on the card. Different styles, different tools. Ballpoint versus felt tip. But handwriting has a logic to it that style alone can't fully hide. The way certain letters sit, the pressure behind certain strokes, the slight leftward lean that showed up in both the capital S on sign and the capital S in the word something she'd written on the card. I looked at those two pieces of paper for a long time. I didn't want to be right. I told myself I could be wrong, that I was a grieving man, looking for patterns in things that might just be coincidence. That the mind does that when it's hurting, finds connections that aren't there. But Arthur had told me to notice everything, so I noticed. I put both papers away, the card back in the drawer, the bag note in the folder I'd started keeping in my desk. I picked up my notebook and wrote down exactly what I'd observed, exactly what I'd compared, and exactly what I wasn't yet certain enough to conclude. Then I closed the notebook and sat in the quiet of my kitchen. Outside, the street was empty. The dark blue sedan was not there. But I had a feeling, the same feeling I'd had standing outside my father's house, watching that curtain fall, that the quiet wasn't going to last. And when it broke, I needed every page of that notebook to be ready. Gloria called me on a Wednesday morning with a voice full of warmth she hadn't shown me since before the funeral. I think we all need to come together, she said, as a family. Share some memories, talk about Daddy start the healing process. Sunday afternoon at the house. Can you come? I said yes before she finished the sentence. Not because I wanted to sit in my father's living room and pretend everything was normal. Not because I thought Gloria's intentions were what she was presenting them to be. I said yes because Arthur had taught me something in that cluttered little office on Beatty's Ford Road, that the most valuable information you'll ever receive from your opponent is what they say when they think they're winning. Gloria thought she was winning, so I was going to let her talk. I arrived at my father's house on Sunday at 2 p.m. 6 or 7 family members were already there, cousins I hadn't seen in months. A couple of Harold's old neighbors who'd stayed close with the family, and Uncle Clifford, who was sitting in the armchair nearest the window with a glass of sweet tea and the expression of a man who had already made up his mind about something. Clifford Washington had been my father's closest friend for 40 years. Not a blood relative, the uncle was the kind of title that gets assigned by duration and loyalty rather than biology. He'd been at every Calloway family event I could remember, had helped my father build the back deck on the Farmingdale house, had sat with Harold through the worst stretch after my mother passed. If Gloria wanted anyone in that room to validate her version of events, Clifford was the one whose endorsement meant the most. She'd clearly done her work on him before Sunday. He looked at me when I came in, not unkindly, but with a particular quality of restraint, like a man choosing his words carefully because he didn't fully trust himself to say the right ones. He nodded. I nodded back. We didn't hug the way we normally would have. Vanessa was there too, seated beside Gloria, on the couch close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching. Derek stood near the back of the room, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a glass he hadn't drunk from. He glanced at me when I came in, then looked at his watch. The first of what I would count as 9 times in 2 hours. Gloria started talking around 2:30. She framed it as remembrance stories about Harold, things he'd said, moments she wanted to preserve. And she was good at it, I'll give her that. She had a storyteller's instincts, knew how to set a room at ease, knew how to make people lean in. For the first 20 minutes, it was almost convincing. Then she started rewriting history. Daddy got so lonely those last few months. She said, her voice dropping into something softer and sadder. He'd call me sometimes just to have someone to talk to. He said he felt like people had gotten busy. She paused. Let that sit. I made a point of being there as much as I could. Some of us did. She didn't look at me when she said that last part. She didn't have to. Clifford set down his glass. Harold mentioned that, he said quietly. Said he felt like he was on his own more than he'd expected. I kept my face still. Every instinct I had wanted to push back to say that I'd called my father every single morning, that Gloria was the one who'd answered and redirected those calls, that I'd stood on that porch and watched the curtain fall. But Arthur's voice was in my ear. Let them show you who they are. Don't give them a reason to recalibrate. So I sat, and I listened, and I kept my right hand in my jacket pocket, 2 fingers resting on the screen of my phone, which I had set to record the moment I walked through the door. Those last few weeks especially, Gloria continued, Daddy needed a lot of support. Vanessa was there every single day. She smiled at her granddaughter. Every single day. Vanessa lowered her eyes modestly. I tried to come by, I said. My voice came out measured and calm and surprised me a little with how steady it was. A few times, there was always a reason it wasn't a good time. He needed rest, Raymond, Gloria said. He didn't want the stress of... I understand. I let her have it. I just want that noted. Clifford looked at me, then at Gloria. Something moved across his face, not doubt, not yet, but a question. A small one, the kind that gets planted and takes time to grow. The room shifted back to safer ground after that, more stories, some laughter, the kind of afternoon that might almost have felt normal if I hadn't known what it was actually for. It was about an hour in when Gloria said it. She was talking about the final weeks, again describing the rhythm of care, the way the household had operated. She was comfortable now, settled into her narrative, surrounded by people who were nodding along. I made sure Daddy had everything he needed, she said. It was a full-time job, honestly, managing his appointments, his medications, making sure he wasn't overwhelmed. She shook her head with the particular weariness of someone performing sacrifice for an audience. I handled who came and who didn't. It was the only way to keep things stable for him. I heard it the moment she said it. I handled who came and who didn't. Not, we tried to keep things calm, or the doctor recommended limited visitors. She handled it. Personally. Deliberately. By her own account, she had been the one deciding who got access to Harold Calloway in the final weeks of his life. I didn't react. I kept my expression exactly where it was, somewhere between listening and neutral, and pressed my fingers a little more firmly against the phone in my pocket. When the afternoon wound down and people began to drift toward the door, Clifford caught my eye across the room. He moved toward me, and for a moment I thought he was going to say something. His mouth opened slightly, the way a person's does when they're working up to difficult words. Clifford, Gloria's voice came from across the room, smooth as ever. Can you help me with these chairs before you go? He stopped, looked at me one more second, then he turned toward Gloria. I walked out to my car alone. I sat behind the wheel and replayed the afternoon in my head. The room full of family, the carefully constructed story, Clifford's almost question that never made it out of his throat. And somewhere underneath all of it, Gloria's own words recorded on my phone, spoken freely in front of witnesses. I handled who came and who didn't. She'd built herself a stage and delivered exactly the line I needed her to deliver. The only thing left to figure out was when and in front of which judge I was going to play it back. September came in hot and slow the way it does in Charlotte when summer refuses to let go. Vanessa came back on the first Tuesday of the month. No phone call ahead of time, no warning, just her car in my driveway, and her hand on my doorbell at 10 in the morning. I'd been expecting her. I just hadn't known exactly when. I started thinking of her visits as rounds, like a boxing match where one side had already decided the outcome and the other side was simply trying to stay upright long enough for the truth to land. Round one was gentle. She came in, sat down, and tried a different angle than the portfolio and the date stamp. She talked about family, about what Harold would have wanted, about how a long legal process would cost money. We'd both rather keep drain energy, we'd both rather spend elsewhere and leave wounds that might never fully heal. He was a peacemaker, Daddy, she said. You know that. He hated conflict. He would have hated seeing us like this. Then maybe the people who created this conflict should have thought about that, I said quietly. She let that go. She left the disclaimer on the table and told me to think about it. I walked her out and then carried the document directly to my desk, where I added it to the folder with everything else. Same document as before, same print date in the corner, but this time her attorney's firm name was on the header. I wrote that down too. Round two came 8 days later, and this time she brought company. A man I didn't know. Mid-40s briefcase, the particular posture of someone who charges by the hour and knows. It sat down at my kitchen table and spent 30 minutes explaining, in careful and technical language, exactly why the codicil was legally sound, why contesting it would be expensive and unlikely to succeed, and why signing the disclaimer was, in his professional opinion, the most sensible option available to me. I listened to every word. I asked one question when he finished. Are you representing me or Vanessa? He blinked. I'm here to provide information. Because if you're representing Vanessa, then everything you just told me is an argument for her position, not objective legal advice. And if you're representing me, I didn't hire you, which means you're not actually my attorney. I stood up. I think we're done. Vanessa's jaw tightened as they left. But she came back. Round three was the one that almost broke something in me. She came alone that time in the evening, and she looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before. Not performative tired, actually worn down. She sat across from me, and after a few minutes of careful lead-up, she started crying. Not sobbing, just quiet tears, the kind that come from somewhere real. I don't want to be at war with you, she said. I don't want to spend the next year of my life fighting in a courtroom. Grandpa Harold is gone, and I miss him, Daddy. I miss him, and I want this to be over. I sat very still and watched my daughter cry, and felt something twist in my chest that I don't have a clean word for. Because part of me, the part that had held her when she was 4 years old and scared of thunderstorms, the part that had driven 3 hours to her college campus at midnight when her first serious relationship ended, that part believed her. Not about the estate, not about any of it, but about the grief. That grief looked real. Vanessa, I said softly, are you in some kind of trouble? She looked up. Something crossed her face, sharp and unguarded, just for a second before the composure came back down like a shade being drawn. The only trouble here is this situation, she said, and you're the one keeping it going. She wiped her face, straightened in her chair, and was someone else again by the time she stood up to leave. But I wrote down what I'd seen in that unguarded second. I wrote it down because Arthur had told me to write everything down, and because whatever that look meant, it was the most honest thing she'd shown me in months. Round four dropped any remaining pretense. She called rather than came in person, and her voice had a flatness to it I hadn't heard before. Daddy, I need you to understand something. Contesting a will in North Carolina is not a short process. It's not cheap. You're looking at legal fees that could run tens of thousands of dollars, a process that takes a year or more, and a judge who may well look at a properly executed codicil and uphold it anyway. You will spend everything you have and end up with less than what I'm offering you right now. Then I'll spend it, I said. That's not rational. Maybe not, but it's what I'm going to do. She hung up without saying goodbye. Round five came on the last Friday of September, and Derek came with her. He stood in my doorway, big quiet, with the particular stillness of a man who has decided what he wants to project. And while Vanessa went through her talking points, one more time, Derek watched me from across the room, with his arms folded and his jaw set. When Vanessa paused, he spoke. Mr. Calloway. His voice was measured, deliberate. I say this with respect. You're a reasonable man, and reasonable men recognize when a situation has already been determined. Holding out doesn't change the math. It just changes how much of yourself you spend getting to the same place. I looked at him for a moment. Derek, I said, is that advice or something else? It's perspective, he said. Appreciate it. I turned to Vanessa. You know where the door is. After they left, I sat at my desk and opened my notebook to a fresh page. 5 visits, 5 different approaches: warmth, legal pressure, grief, financial threat, and now Derek standing in my doorway talking about math and determination. I wrote down every detail I could remember from each one: times, dates, who was present, what was said. Then I wrote one line at the bottom of the page and underlined it twice. She's not desperate because she wants to win. She needs to win fast. Why? I didn't have the answer yet, but somewhere in the pattern of 5 visits in 30 days, in Derek's careful language about things being already determined, in the flash of something raw and scared on Vanessa's face. During round 3, the answer was already taking shape. I just needed one more piece before it came into focus. Arthur called on a Monday morning in early October, and his voice had a different quality than usual. Not urgent exactly, but purposeful. The way a man sounds when he's found something he's been looking for. "There's someone I need you to meet," he said. "Her name is Dolores Mack. She took care of your father for the last 3 years. I've spoken with her twice this week, and Ray, she was there. She saw things. We met at a diner on West Boulevard that Dolores had chosen a place she clearly knew well, because the woman at the counter greeted her by name and had her coffee waiting before she sat down. Dolores Mack was 62 years old, built solid and steady, with the kind of unhurried calm that comes from 30 years of sitting with people in their most vulnerable moments. She'd been a registered nurse before transitioning to private home care, and she brought to both professions the same quality I noticed the moment she shook my hand. She paid attention. Full, complete, undistracted attention. She looked at me across the table and said, "You look like him," around the eyes. I didn't trust myself to respond to that right away, so I just nodded and let her start. "Mr. Harold was a good man," she said. "Sharp right up until close to the end. He did his crossword every morning, read the paper, knew exactly who everybody was and what day it was." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I want you to understand that first before I tell you the rest. Because what I'm going to tell you doesn't mean he was confused all the time. It means something was wrong on a specific day in a specific set of circumstances." "I understand," I said. "In those last 17 days, something changed in how the house ran. Before that, I set my own schedule. I came when I came, family stopped by. When they stopped by, Mr. Harold had his routines. After that, somewhere around the 3rd week of June, Miss Gloria started calling me before my shifts, telling me what time to arrive, when to leave, who was expected." She paused. "I'm a professional. I've worked in a lot of homes. There's a difference between a family member helping coordinate care and a family member controlling access. What Miss Gloria was doing was the second thing." I kept my hands flat on the table, kept my breathing even. "Did my father ask about me during that time?" Dolores looked at me steadily. "Every morning, Mr. Ray, first thing before his crossword, before his coffee even, has Raymond called. And I had to tell him I didn't know because I wasn't the one answering the phone anymore." The diner noise around a silverware conversation, the bell above the door, seemed to come from very far away. "There were a few times," she continued, "when you called and asked to come by. I know because Mr. Harold told me. He'd get a look on his face, hopeful. You know how people get when they're expecting something good, and then later that look would be gone, and he wouldn't say why." She set down her cup. "I figured out why eventually, Gloria turned him away," I said. "She told him you were busy, that you'd said you'd try to make it, but something came up." Dolores's voice was careful and precise, the voice of someone who understands the weight of what they're saying. "I don't know if she told you the same thing in reverse, but that's what he heard." I thought about all the mornings I'd called and gotten Gloria's voice instead of his. All the times she'd said he was resting, wasn't up for company, had asked for quiet. He hadn't asked for quiet. He'd been asking where I was. "Tell me about the day the new document was signed," I said. Dolores nodded slowly, like she'd been expecting this question. "I remember it clearly because I wrote it down. That's something I do. I keep a care log for every patient. Daily entries, observations about mood, cognition, physical condition. It's a habit from my nursing days, and it's protected me more than once when families disagreed about a patient's condition." She reached into her bag and set a worn composition notebook on the table between us. "June 18th. I wrote 3 things. First, that Mr. Harold seemed more fatigued than usual, not his normal tired, but a different kind. slower to respond, less focused. Second, that there was a visitor I hadn't seen before. A man in a navy suit, gray at the temples. He came with Miss Gloria. They went into the study with Mr. Harold and stayed close to an hour. She tapped the notebook. Third, and I wrote this in my own words because it bothered me, Mr. Harold seemed uncertain when he came out. He sat in his chair and looked at his hands for a long time. He didn't do his crossword that afternoon. A man in a navy suit, I said, gray at the temples, about 6 feet tall. That's right. Something shifted in my chest, not surprise exactly, but the particular sensation of a piece clicking into place. I saw him, I said, the morning my father passed. He was in the house going through the desk. I didn't know who he was. Dolores looked at me for a moment. Then you've seen him twice, she said quietly. Once when something was signed. Once when something was being taken. I sat with that for a moment. Then I took out my phone and called Arthur. He answered on the second ring. I'm with Dolores, I said. She has a care log with a dated entry for June 18th. She saw the man in the navy suit, same description as the one I saw at the house the morning Pop passed. Arthur, who witnessed the codicil. There has to be a name on that document. I heard papers moving on his end. A pause. Garrett Collins, Arthur said. Notary public. His commission was suspended 8 months ago. Another pause, shorter this time. And Ray, I pulled his business records this morning. Garrett Collins has been contracted twice in the past 3 years by a company called Pruitt Development Group. The name landed in the middle of that diner like something thrown hard against a wall. Pruitt, Derek's company. The man who witnessed the codicil, I said slowly, has a financial relationship with my son-in-law. In North Carolina, Arthur said, a person with a material interest in an estate transaction cannot serve as a qualified witness to that transaction. It's a direct conflict. If Collins was working with Derek and Derek benefits from Vanessa's inheritance, that witness signature could seriously damage the codicil's credibility in court. I looked across the table at Dolores, who was watching me with quiet, steady eyes. Arthur, I said, we need to file. I know, he said. Come to the office tomorrow morning. Bring everything. I put the phone down and looked at the care log sitting on the table between us. 30 years of professional habit, one woman's daily discipline, a composition notebook that had been waiting in a bag for the moment it would matter. Dolores, I said, would you be willing to say all of this under oath? She picked up her coffee, took a slow sip, and set it back down. Mr. Ray, she said, I've been waiting for someone to ask. Before I go further, if you've stayed with me this long, it means something. Drop the number 9 in the comments right now so I know you're still here, because what I'm about to show you next, about the paperwork, the dates and the man nobody could identify, starts to change everything. Don't go anywhere. The morning Arthur called, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee I hadn't touched. It had gone cold an hour ago. I was staring at the wall where my father's photo used to hang before I moved it to the bedroom. I couldn't explain why I moved it, only that looking at it from across the room felt wrong now, like watching him through glass. Ray, Arthur's voice was steady, no greeting. I need you to come in today if you can. I was in his office by 10. Arthur was standing when I arrived, which was unusual. He was a man who sat to think and only stood when something had changed. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk and waited until I sat before he spoke. I filed the caveat this morning, he said. I knew what that meant. We had discussed it the week before a formal legal challenge to the codicil submitted to Mecklenburg County Probate Court. Once filed, the court would suspend any distribution of the estate until the matter was resolved. It was the first real move we had made in the open. How did Vanessa's attorneys respond? I asked. Arthur allowed himself a small, measured smile. Faster than I expected, within 2 hours, which tells me they were ready for it. He set a manila folder on the desk and slid it toward me. I opened it. Inside were photocopies of court filings, dates, signatures, case numbers. Arthur leaned forward and pointed to a line near the bottom of one page. The codicil was filed with the probate court on July 9th, he said, 4 days after your father passed. You mentioned that before. You said 2 to 3 weeks is normal. I did? But look at this. He tapped another document. The filing was submitted at 8:47 in the morning, on a Friday. The form was complete notarized and accompanied by a certified death certificate. He paused. Your father died on a Saturday. The death certificate was issued the following Tuesday. I stared at the page. That's not possible, I said. No, it is not. Arthur straightened. Someone had that filing prepared before your father was even confirmed dead. They had the paperwork ready. They were waiting. The room felt smaller than usual. I thought about Gloria opening the door in her pressed blouse on the morning Pop died. The navy-suited man moving through the house like he owned it. The way she had said the funeral home was already on the way before I had asked a single question. Who filed it? I asked. Arthur opened a second folder. The name tied to both the codicil witness page and the later court submission was Garrett Collins. He let the name settle. The same man whose notary commission was suspended 8 months ago. The same man Dolores saw in your father's house on June 18th. I put the paper down. Can they do that? Use a suspended notary for a court filing? No. A suspended notary has no legal authority to certify any document. If Collins notarized the submission cover, the filing is procedurally defective. Arthur sat back, and there is more. He introduced me then to someone I had not yet met, Patrick Elmore. Arthur explained that Patrick was the court-appointed executor, a 50-year-old man with a background in estate administration, assigned by the probate court to manage Harold Calloway's estate, independently of the family. Arthur had contacted him earlier that week. Patrick had agreed to speak with me. Patrick arrived at 11. He was precise in the way that men who work with paperwork for 20 years tend to be careful with his words, slow to commit to anything he hadn't verified. He shook my hand and sat beside Arthur without offering small talk. Mr. Calloway, he said, I've reviewed the filing timeline on your father's estate. I have some concerns I've already noted formally with the court. What kind of concerns? I asked. The submission date discrepancy is the first, he said. The death certificate issue Arthur mentioned, but there's something additional. He opened a folder of his own. When I requested the original inventory of estate assets, standard procedure, I was told by the filing attorney that the inventory was still being compiled. That's acceptable within the first 60 days. But attached to the codicil submission was a partial asset summary that referenced the life insurance policy payout, the savings account balance, and the appraised value of the Beattiesford Road property. He looked at me carefully before continuing. That information is not public record. It would only be available to someone with prior access to your father's private financial documents. I sat with that for a moment. Meaning someone had been inside his accounts before he died. It would appear so, Patrick said. I flagged it. The court will want an explanation. After Patrick left, I sat alone with Arthur for a while. The office was quiet, except for the low hum of the building's old HVAC system. What happens now? I asked. The court has the caveat. Patrick has flagged the irregularities. We wait for a hearing date. Arthur folded his hands on the desk. But Ray, the sealed envelope. Your father gave it to me for a reason. If the court orders it opened, what's inside will either confirm everything or complicate it. I nodded. I already knew it would not simplify anything. There's one more thing, Arthur said, and his tone shifted just slightly, careful measured. I looked into the codicil witnesses more carefully. Collins is one. The second witness signed with initials only TR. He paused. The court will ask who TR is. And so far, no one on Vanessa's legal team has offered an answer. I drove home thinking about initials. TR. 2 letters. Someone who was there on June 18th and didn't want to be known. I added it to the notebook. The call came on a Tuesday evening just after 7. I was at the kitchen table again. It had become the place where I did most of my thinking since my father died, going through the notebook I had been keeping since August. 4 months of dates, names, phone logs, and observations. The pages had started to feel less like a record and more like a map, and I was still trying to figure out where it led. The number on my phone screen was one I recognized but hadn't expected. Uncle Clifford Weiss. I answered on the second ring. Ray? His voice was slower than I remembered from the family meeting, heavier. I've been sitting on something for a few weeks now. I wasn't sure if it was my place to say it, but I think it is. I'm listening, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Your father called me in May. About 6 weeks before he passed. He didn't say much, you know how Harold was. He never said more than he needed to, but he told me that if anything happened to him, I should pay attention to the details. That was the word he used. Details. I set my pen down. Did he say anything else? He said you'd know what to do. A pause. I didn't understand it then. I think I'm starting to now. I asked him to meet me. He agreed without hesitation. We met 2 days later at a coffee shop on South Boulevard that my father used to like. Clifford was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a cup of black coffee he hadn't touched. He was 70 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of stillness that comes from a long life and a lot of patience. He and my father had been close for over 40 years. They had worked together, argued over baseball scores, and sat at each other's bedsides during hard times. If anyone outside the immediate family knew Harold Calloway, it was Clifford Weiss. He slid a folded piece of paper across the table before I even sat down. Gloria asked me to sign something in late June, he said. She called it a character letter, said the family wanted to document Harold's state of mind in his final weeks. For the estate record, she said, I signed it. He tapped the paper. That's my copy. I kept it because something felt off, but I couldn't name what. I unfolded it carefully. It was a single-type page, a statement affirming that Harold Calloway had been clear-minded, communicative, and at peace with his decisions during the final month of his life. At the bottom were 2 signature lines. One was Clifford's. The other was signed with 2 initials. TR. I read the initials twice. Then I looked up at Clifford. Do you know who this is? I asked, pointing to the second signature. He nodded slowly. Thomas Rourke. He's a property assessor. Semi-retired. Gloria introduced us at Harold's house sometime in early June. She said he was an old friend of the family. He paused. I'd never heard your father mention him once. I called Arthur from the parking lot before I even started the car. Thomas Rourke, I said when he answered. A brief silence. Say that again. Tar, the second codicil witness. His name is Thomas Rourke. He's a property assessor. He signed a character letter with Clifford Weiss in late June, introduced to the family by Gloria. I heard the sound of Arthur writing. A property assessor, he repeated. Ray, do you understand what that means in context? Tell me. If Derek Pruitt is trying to move a $340,000 real estate transaction that requires a legal heir's signature, and if that transaction involves a property appraisal, then a property assessor with ties to Gloria and access to your father's house in June is not a coincidence. I stood in the parking lot and let that settle. He connected the deal, I said. Rourke connected Derek's transaction to the codicil. Potentially. And if Rourke has a financial relationship with Pruitt Development Group, then we have 2 compromised witnesses on that codicil, not 1. Arthur's voice was controlled, but I could hear the weight behind it. I'm going to request Rourke's professional licensing records and any filed assessments linked to Pruitt properties in the past 2 years. Patrick needs to know this as well. I drove back to Clifford's coffee shop. He was still at the corner table. I sat down across from him and told him what Arthur had said. Not everything, but enough. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he set both hands flat on the table. I trusted Gloria, he said. She told me it was routine. She told me Harold wanted it documented. He shook his head once slowly. I should have called you in June. You called me now, I said. He looked at me steadily. What do you need from me? Arthur may need you to provide that letter to the court, and he may need you to testify about how you came to sign it, when, where, who asked you, and who introduced you to Rourke. Clifford didn't hesitate. Then that's what I'll do. That night I opened the notebook to a fresh page and wrote 2 words at the top, Thomas Rourke. Below it I wrote everything, the character letter, the initials Clifford's account of the introduction, the date, in early June, and Arthur's theory about the property assessor's connection to Derek's deal. I drew a line connecting Rourke's name to Collins's name from the previous page. 2 witnesses, both compromised, both connected to Gloria or Derek, both present in my father's life in the weeks before he signed something he may not have fully understood. I sat back and looked at the 2 names on the page. Somewhere in Arthur's office, a sealed envelope waited. My father had prepared it 2 years before any of this began, as if he had known not exactly what would happen, but that something would. I was beginning to think the envelope wasn't just evidence. I was beginning to think it was a message. The letter from Mecklenburg County Probate Court arrived on a Thursday. I had been checking the mail every day since Arthur filed the caveat, not because I expected anything to move quickly. Probate courts in North Carolina rarely do, but because waiting without watching felt like giving ground I hadn't agreed to give. So I was standing at the mailbox when the envelope came, and I recognized the court seal before I had fully pulled it free of the slot. I read it twice on the front porch before I called Arthur. They've set a preliminary hearing, I said. November 19th. 3 weeks. Arthur said. That's faster than I expected. It tells me the judge has already reviewed the filing irregularities Patrick flagged. What happens at the preliminary hearing? The court will want to establish the scope of the dispute. They'll look at the caveat, the codicil, the filing timeline, and the witness question. Judge Sandra Okafor will want to understand why two of the codicil's witnesses have potential conflicts of interest before she decides how to proceed. He paused. She may also order the sealed envelope opened at that hearing, or she may reserve that for a later date. We won't know until we're in the room. I stood on the porch and looked out at the street. The oak tree my father had planted in the front yard when I was 9 years old had already started losing its leaves. November in Charlotte came quietly without drama, and somehow that made everything feel more serious. Arthur, I said, what is Gloria going to do? A brief silence. She'll fight it. She has as much to lose as Vanessa does. Gloria called that same evening. I almost didn't answer. We hadn't spoken directly since the family meeting in August, and every time her name appeared on my phone, I felt the particular exhaustion that comes from dealing with someone who has decided that their version of events is the only one worth considering. But I answered because Arthur had told me early on that I should never refuse contact, that every conversation was a potential record. I heard about the hearing, she said. Her voice was composed, but there was something underneath it that hadn't been there before, a tightness. Arthur filed the caveat, I said. That's standard procedure when there's a question about a will. There is no question, Ray. Daddy knew what he wanted. He signed that codicil of his own free will. Then the court will confirm that I said, and we'll all move forward. She was quiet for a moment. You're making this harder than it needs to be. For the family. For Daddy's memory. I'm asking the court to verify that what's in front of us is actually what Pop wanted. That's not making things hard. That's what he would have done himself. Another silence. Longer this time. There are things you don't know, she said finally. Her tone had shifted, less composed, more careful, as if she had almost said something she hadn't planned to. Then tell me, I said. But she didn't. She said goodnight and ended the call. I wrote it down in the notebook, things you don't know. I underlined it twice. The 2 weeks before the hearing moved the way time moves, when you are waiting for something you can't control slowly in the mornings, and then gone before you noticed the afternoon had passed. Arthur spent those weeks preparing. He compiled the filing date discrepancy, Dolores Mack's written statement about the June 18th visit, Clifford Weiss's character letter with Thomas Rourke's initials, Arthur's research into Garrett Collins' suspended notary commission, and the documented record of Rourke's professional relationship with Pruitt Development Group. He organized everything into a submission he called the Evidentiary Foundation, not a final argument, but a framework the court could use to understand why the caveat had been filed and what questions needed to be answered. Patrick Elmore filed a separate report as executor, formally noting the filing date discrepancy and the unauthorized use of pre-death financial data in the codicil submission. Patrick was precise and unsparing in his language. He used the phrase procedural irregularity 4 times in 3 pages. I read both documents at Arthur's office the Friday before the hearing. When I finished, I set them down on the desk and looked at Arthur. Is it enough? I asked. It's enough to be heard, he said. Whether it's enough to win depends on what Judge Okafor decides to do with the envelope. And if she doesn't order it opened at the preliminary hearing, Arthur folded his hands. Then we make the strongest case we can with what we have, and we wait for a second hearing. He looked at me steadily. But Ray, your father, registered that envelope with this court 2 years ago. He listed it as contingency documentation. Judge Okafor will know it exists. She will want to know what's in it. I nodded. I had thought about the envelope every day since Arthur first showed it to me. I had thought about my father sitting in some quiet room 2 years ago, writing out whatever was inside, sealing it, and trusting it to a man with a small office and a broken elevator. He hadn't told me about it. He hadn't explained it. He had simply left it where the right person would find it at the right time. That was Harold Calloway. He never used 2 words when none would do. The night before the hearing, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook open in front of me and read through every entry I had made since August. 4 months of details. Every call, every visit, every conversation that hadn't felt right. The navy-suited man, the filing date, Collins, Rourke, Gloria's half-finished sentence on the phone. There are things you don't know. I closed the notebook and left it on the table. Tomorrow, some of those things were going to change. I had never been inside a probate courtroom before. I had driven past the Mecklenburg County Courthouse on Providence Road more times than I could count. Over the years, it was one of those buildings you register without really seeing. Solid and gray and permanent against the Charlotte skyline, the kind of structure that exists so reliably in the background of a city that you stop noticing it the way you stop noticing a familiar face in a crowd. But that morning, walking through the front entrance with Arthur beside me and a folder of documents under my arm, the building felt entirely different, heavier, more deliberate, like it had been waiting for this specific Tuesday morning and simply hadn't mentioned it. Arthur had told me what to expect. A preliminary hearing was not a trial. No jury, no dramatic cross-examination, no gavel strikes for order. It was procedural, the judge reviewing the dispute, hearing initial positions from both sides, deciding how to manage the case going forward. He had said it with the calm of a man who had stood in many courtrooms and understood that the machinery of the law moved most effectively when it was not dramatized. I had nodded and told myself I understood. What he hadn't prepared me for was seeing Vanessa walk in with 3 attorneys. She was dressed carefully, dark navy pearl earrings, the kind of presentation that communicates preparation without appearing aggressive. Her lead attorney, Warren Caldwell, was mid-50s, silver-haired, with the practiced ease of a man whose hourly rate had long since exceeded any need to appear eager. He carried himself the way expensive lawyers do, as if the room had been arranged specifically for his convenience, and everyone present had tacitly agreed to this arrangement. Vanessa sat across the aisle without looking at me. She opened a folder, spoke quietly to Caldwell, and kept her eyes forward. I watched her for a moment, and then I looked away, because there was nothing useful in what I was feeling, and I had learned over the past 4 months that usefulness was the standard I needed to hold myself to. Gloria was in the back row. She had come alone, which surprised me. No lawyer, no ally, just Gloria in a dark coat, sitting very still, watching the front of the room, with the particular attention of someone who has planned something carefully, and is now waiting to see if the plan holds. Judge Sandra Okafor entered at 9:03. She was 60 years old, close-cropped gray hair with a way of moving that communicated exactly one thing. She had very little patience for the performance of legal proceedings and considerable patience for the substance of them. She settled at the bench, opened the file in front of her, and read for a full minute before she acknowledged the room. When she looked up, her expression suggested she had already formed a number of preliminary opinions and was prepared to test them. "We are here on the matter of the Calloway estate caveat," she said. "I've reviewed the filing submitted by Mr. Browne on behalf of Raymond Calloway, the executor's report from Mr. Elmore, and the response filed by Mr. Caldwell on behalf of Vanessa Calloway Pruitt." She looked up. "I have questions for both sides. Mr. Browne, you filed first. Begin." Arthur stood. He was the oldest person in the room by at least a decade, in a suit that had seen better years, but had been pressed that morning with evident care. He spoke without notes, without hesitation, and without the performance of urgency that younger lawyers sometimes substituted for substance. "Your Honor, the caveat filed on behalf of Raymond Calloway challenges the validity of a codicil dated June 18th of this year on 2 primary grounds. First, the codicil was witnessed by 2 individuals, Garrett Collins and Thomas Rourke, both of whom had documented financial relationships with parties standing to benefit from the altered distribution. Under North Carolina General Statute 31-10, a witness to a testamentary document must be disinterested. Neither Collins nor Rourke meets that standard." Judge Okafor wrote something without looking up. "And the second ground, the codicil was submitted to this court on July 9th, 4 days after Harold Calloway's death, accompanied by a death certificate not issued until July 8th, and a pre-compiled asset summary containing private financial information unavailable through public record. The executor's report documents this discrepancy in precise detail." The judge looked at Caldwell. "Counselor." Caldwell rose with the smoothness of a man accustomed to having rooms wait for him. "Your Honor, the codicil was properly executed in the presence of 2 witnesses and reflects Harold Calloway's clearly stated final wishes. Any professional associations the witnesses may have had with other parties are incidental and do not rise to the level of legal disqualification under the statute. As for the filing timeline, administrative preparation is a standard legal service retained by families in anticipation of estate matters. Judge Okafor looked at him steadily. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they are measuring before deciding how much weight to put on it. Mr. Caldwell, are you representing to this court that both witnesses to this codicil were disinterested parties under 31-10? A pause. Brief but present. We believe the record supports that position, Your Honor. Do you have documentation of their disinterested status available today? A second pause, shorter than the first, but I noticed it the way I had trained myself over 4 months to notice the spaces between words. We can provide supplemental documentation within 10 days, Your Honor. Judge Okafor wrote again. She wrote for longer than seemed strictly necessary, and the courtroom held its quiet while she did. It was the particular quiet of a room full of people who understand that something is being decided and have the collective good sense not to interrupt it. When she looked up, she addressed both sides without ceremony. I am placing the codicil under provisional suspension pending further review. No distribution of estate assets will proceed until the witness qualifications are verified and submitted to this court for examination. She turned to Patrick Elmore. Mr. Elmore, I am directing you to compile a full inventory of estate assets with complete chain of custody documentation for all items referenced in the codicil submission. That report is due to this court within 21 days. Patrick nodded once. Understood, Your Honor. Then she looked at Arthur directly. Mr. Browne, the court is aware that Harold Calloway registered a sealed, notarized affidavit with this office approximately 2 years ago, designated as contingency documentation under case file number MC-2023-4471. Is that document relevant to the caveat before this court? We believe it is, Your Honor, Arthur said. Judge Okafor looked at the file again, turned a page, and made a notation. I will review the registration record and determine whether to order its opening at the next scheduled hearing. She set her pen down with a finality that suggested the session was approaching its close. We will reconvene on December 10th. I expect full documentation from all parties before that date. She closed the file. The session had lasted 41 minutes. Outside in the hallway, I stood with Arthur and let the building's ordinary noise come back around me. Footsteps, voices, the distant sound of an elevator arriving. Vanessa's team moved past us without acknowledgement. I watched Caldwell speaking into his phone at the far end of the corridor, his voice too low to catch his free hand, moving in the small controlled gestures of a man managing a problem he had not fully anticipated. Gloria walked out of the courtroom and down the hallway without making eye contact with anyone. She pushed through the exit door and was gone before I had fully processed that she had left. She suspended the codicil, I said. She did, Arthur said. And the envelope. He nodded slowly. December 10th. She'll decide then. He looked at me with the measured steadiness he brought to every difficult piece of information. Ray, when that envelope opens, whatever is inside, be prepared for it. Your father was a careful man. Careful men don't leave things behind without a reason. I looked down the hallway toward the glass doors where the gray November light came in flat and even. 3 weeks? Whatever my father had sealed and registered and trusted to Arthur Browne had already waited 2 years. But standing in that hallway, I understood for the first time that the waiting had not been passive. My father had not simply hidden something and hoped for the best. He had constructed something carefully, precisely, the way he did everything, and then he had waited for the right moment to let it work. I was beginning to understand that I had never been fighting this alone. The days after the hearing moved differently than the days before it. Before November 19th, every morning had carried a specific weight, the weight of building something, of gathering evidence and names and dates, of moving toward a fixed point I could see on the horizon, even if I couldn't make out the details. After the hearing, the motion had stopped. The codicil was suspended, the inventory was in Patrick's hands, and the envelope was still sealed inside Arthur's office in a building with a broken elevator on Beatty's Ford Road. There was nothing left for me to construct, nothing to research, nothing to file. There was only the calendar and the slow turn of days between November 19th and December 10th. I had never been good at waiting. My father used to say that patience was not the absence of movement, it was movement directed inward. I was still learning what that meant. Caldwell's supplemental documentation arrived at Arthur's office on November 28th, one day before the 10-day deadline the judge had set. Arthur called me that evening while I was standing in the kitchen making dinner I had no real appetite for. He submitted character statements for both Collins and Rourke, Arthur said, signed declarations asserting that neither man had a financial interest in the Calloway estate at the time of the codicil signing. Are they credible? I asked. Arthur was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was measuring his words. Collins's statement was notarized by a colleague in his former firm. That's borderline, but arguable. He paused. Rourke's statement was notarized by a man named Gerald Pruitt. I set down the spoon I was holding. Pruitt, Derek Pruitt's uncle, semi-retired, still holds an active notary commission in Mecklenburg County. Arthur let that sit. I've already drafted a motion flagging the conflict for the court. Judge Okafor will have it before the 10th. After we finished talking, I stood at the stove for a long time, without turning the burner back on. I thought about the careful architecture of everything in front of me, the way each name connected to another, the way every thread led back to the same small circle of people who had been moving through my father's final weeks, like surveyors measuring land they had already decided to take. Collins to Derek, Rourke to Gerald Pruitt to Derek, Gloria at the center managing the visit schedule, deciding who came in and who stayed out. My father had seen it. Somehow, in whatever clarity remained in those final weeks, Harold Calloway had seen it coming and had said nothing out loud to anyone except Arthur Browne and a sealed envelope. Derek called on Thursday, December 4th from a number I didn't recognize. He identified himself immediately, and I noticed that his voice carried something it hadn't. Before a tightness beneath the controlled surface, the sound of a man who had been managing a problem that was no longer cooperating with his timeline. Ray, I think we need to talk, man to man outside of all the legal back and forth. I'm listening, I said. The hearing on the 10th, I want you to understand what's at stake here. Not just for Vanessa, for a lot of people depending on a transaction that cannot move forward, while the estate is sitting in limbo. He paused. There are business commitments involved. Partners who made decisions based on the assumption that certain things would be resolved by now. Timelines that don't bend easily. What kind of transaction, I asked, though I already knew. A beat of silence. A property acquisition, significant. The kind of deal that doesn't come back around once it falls through. $340,000, I said. The silence that followed was long enough that I counted 4 seconds before he spoke again. You've done your homework, he said. His tone had shifted flatter, now stripped of the careful warmth he had maintained at the family meeting in August and at every exchange since. I'm asking you to think about what it would mean to let this go. For the family. For everyone involved. He left the word everyone hanging between us like an open question, and I understood that it was meant to feel like more than a word. I appreciate you calling Derek, I said. I'll see you on the 10th. I ended the call, picked up the notebook, and wrote everything down, the date, the time, the unfamiliar phone number, his exact phrasing, the 4-second silence, the way he had said everyone. I sent Arthur a full summary within the hour. Arthur's reply came back in 3 words. Good. Keep everything. Clifford came by on Sunday, December 7th, without calling ahead. He appeared at the door with a tin of shortbread he said he had made himself from his late wife's recipe. The edges were uneven, and the tin was sealed with masking tape, which told me he was telling the truth. I made coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table and did not talk about the hearing for the first 20 minutes. We talked about my father instead. Clifford told me about the summer of 1987 when Harold had driven 4 hours in July heat to help him move into his first house, showing up with 2 strong arms and a back injury he hadn't mentioned until they were already halfway through unloading the truck. He told me about the year my mother was sick, how Harold had called him every Sunday evening, without explanation or agenda, just to talk, just to be present until she recovered. He said Harold had never once asked for acknowledgement for anything he had done for anyone, and that he had known very few men in 70 years of living who could say the same. He was a man who believed in the long game, Clifford said, holding his cup in both hands. Never made a move without thinking 3 moves ahead, sometimes 4. I looked at him across the table. He left that envelope 2 years before any of this started? Clifford nodded slowly. 3 moves ahead, Ray, at least. After he left, I stood at the front window and watched his car disappear down the street. The oak tree in the yard had gone fully bare by then, the branches dark and still against a white December sky, holding nothing. 3 days. Whatever my father had sealed and registered and trusted to Arthur Browne was going to open on December 10th. I didn't know what was inside. I had told myself for weeks that I was prepared for whatever it was. Standing at that window watching the bare tree, I understood for the first time that preparation and readiness are not the same thing. I went back to the kitchen table. I opened the notebook to the last blank page and wrote at the top, "What did you know, Pop, and when did you know it?" I left the rest of the page empty. Some questions deserve room for the answer. I arrived at the courthouse 40 minutes early. Arthur was already there when I came through the security line, standing near the window at the end of the hallway, with his briefcase open on the bench beside him, reviewing documents the way he always did, slowly, without apparent urgency, as if the pace of the reading itself was a form of discipline. He looked up when I approached and gave me a single nod. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "I'm here," I said. He accepted that without comment, which was one of the things I had come to appreciate about Arthur Browne. He never pushed for more than a man was ready to give. We went over the morning sequence one more time while we waited. Patrick Elmore had submitted the full estate inventory with chain of custody documentation 3 days ahead of schedule. Arthur had filed his motion regarding Gerald Pruitt's conflict of interest in notarizing Rourke's character statement. Both documents were in Judge Okafor's file. The only remaining question, the question that had been sitting at the center of everything since August, was what the judge intended to do with the sealed envelope registered under file number MC-2023-4471. At 8:55, Vanessa walked in with Warren Caldwell and one associate. She was dressed in charcoal gray this time. She sat across the aisle without looking at me. Gloria came in 2 minutes later and took the same seat in the back row she had occupied at the preliminary hearing, hands folded in her lap, face composed into an expression I had learned to read over 58 years of knowing her. She was afraid. Judge Sandra Okafor entered at 9:02 and went directly to business. "Before we proceed to arguments," she said, setting a single folder on the bench, "I want to address the matter of the sealed affidavit registered by Harold Calloway with this court under file MC-2023-4471. She looked at both sides of the aisle. "I have reviewed the registration record. The document was notarized on September 14th, 2023, witnessed by 2 independent parties unconnected to the Calloway family, and registered with specific instructions that it be opened only in the event of a formal legal contest over Mr. Calloway's estate." She paused. "A formal contest has been filed. The condition has been met." She looked at Arthur. "Mr. Browne, you are the registered custodian. Please bring the document forward." Arthur rose, reached into his briefcase, and produced the envelope. I had seen it once before in his office the afternoon he first showed it to me. It looked the same as it had then, cream-colored, sealed with wax, stamped with a notary mark, and marked in my father's handwriting across the front. Arthur carried it to the clerk, who brought it to the bench. Judge Okafor examined the seal, confirmed the notary stamp and registration number, allowed for the record, and then opened it with a letter opener she produced from the desk drawer. The courtroom was completely silent. She read it to herself first. The reading took 4 minutes. I watched her face and could not interpret it. She had the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades ensuring that her expressions revealed nothing before she was ready. When she finished, she looked up. "I'm going to read this into the record," she said, "in its entirety." My father's voice came back to me through someone else's reading, and it was the strangest thing I had experienced in a long time, hearing Harold Calloway's words in Judge Okafor's measured courtroom cadence, precise and unhurried, as if he had written every sentence knowing exactly how it would eventually be delivered. He began by stating his full name, his date of birth, his address on Beatty's Ford Road, and the date of the affidavit, September 14th, 2023. He stated that he was of sound mind, that he had prepared the document without assistance, and that he had registered it with the court because he did not trust that it would survive in any other location. Then he wrote about Vanessa. He wrote that in the spring of 2021, his daughter had come to him in financial difficulty. Debt he described as significant and connected to her husband's business dealings. He had lent her $96,000. He had documented the loan with a promissory note signed by Vanessa in his presence due 90 days after his death. He stated that he had not forgiven the debt and did not intend to, and that the note was held separately with Arthur Browne. He wrote that in early 2023 he had become aware that Vanessa and Gloria had begun discussing his estate in terms that troubled him. He did not describe specific conversations, but he wrote that he had heard enough through open doors and incomplete silences to understand that his wishes were not being treated as fixed. He wrote, "A man learns to listen to what is not said." He wrote about his original will. He stated that it reflected his true intentions and that any document purporting to alter those intentions produced in the final months of his life should be examined carefully. He wrote that his health had declined in the spring of 2023 and that he was aware his clarity would not be permanent. He wrote, "I am writing this now because I do not know how well I will be able to write it later." He named no villains. He made no accusations. He stated only what he knew, what he had observed, and what he wanted the record to show. The last paragraph was 3 sentences. "Raymond has always done what was right, even when it cost him. I trust him to do what is right here. I am sorry I could not tell him more while I still had the words." The courtroom remained silent for a moment after Judge Okafor finished reading. I looked at my hands in my lap and did not look up for a long time. The words were still in the air around me the way a sound lingers in a room after the source has gone quiet. I'm sorry I could not tell him more while I still had the words. Across the aisle I heard Vanessa speak quietly to Caldwell. I did not hear what she said. From the back row I heard nothing at all from Gloria. When I finally turned to look, she was staring at the floor in front of her, with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Something between recognition and shame. Something that did not have a clean name. Judge Okafor set the affidavit down. "We will take a 15-minute recess," she said. "When we return, I will hear arguments on the codicil's validity." She looked at Caldwell. "Mr. Caldwell, I expect those arguments to account for the contents of this affidavit." Caldwell said nothing. The gavel came down, and the room began to move around me, and I sat still in the middle of all of it, hearing my father's last 3 sentences again in the silence behind the noise. He had known. He had always known. And he had trusted me with the part he couldn't say out loud. The 15-minute recess lasted closer to 20. I spent most of it standing near the window at the end of the hallway, where Arthur and I had reviewed documents that morning, looking out at the parking lot below. The December sky had gone the color of old pewter, flat and low, the kind of sky that doesn't threaten rain so much as simply refuse to let any light through. Charlotte in December had that quality, sometimes not cold enough to feel dramatic, just gray enough to feel honest. Arthur stood beside me. He didn't speak, and I didn't ask him to. Behind us I could hear Warren Caldwell, on his phone, his voice controlled, but moving faster than it had in the courtroom. 2 words reached me clearly before I stopped listening, not anticipated. I wrote them in my memory the way I had trained myself to do since August, and I turned back to the window. When the clerk called us back in, I followed Arthur to our seats and did not look at Vanessa. Judge Okafor returned to the bench with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything set Harold's affidavit to one side and looked at Warren Caldwell. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "you have submitted to this court a declaration asserting that both witnesses to the June 18th codicil were disinterested parties under North Carolina General Statute 31-10. I've now read into the record a notarized affidavit from Harold Calloway himself, expressing concern about alterations to his estate made in the final period of his life. I have also reviewed evidence that one witness, Garrett Collins, held an expired notary commission at the time of signing, and that a second witness, Thomas Rourke, had a documented professional relationship with Pruitt Development Group, a company controlled by the husband of the primary beneficiary named in that codicil." She paused. I want to give you the opportunity to address these points directly. Caldwell rose. He was composed, but something in the set of his shoulders had changed since the morning session, a barely visible adjustment, the kind a man makes when the ground has shifted under him, and he is deciding whether to acknowledge it. Your Honor, the affidavit represents Mr. Calloway's subjective concerns at a specific point in time. It does not constitute direct evidence of undue influence. The codicil itself bears his signature executed in the presence of two witnesses and reflects a documented change in his stated intentions regarding his estate. Judge Okafor looked at him steadily. Mr. Caldwell, Harold Calloway wrote in that affidavit that any document purporting to alter his intentions, produced in the final months of his life, should be examined carefully. He wrote it 2 years before the codicil in question was signed. He registered it with this court so that it would survive outside the control of anyone with an interest in his estate. She set her pen down. That is not a subjective concern. That is a man taking a legal precaution. Caldwell said, "We maintain our position, Your Honor." She looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable. "I'm sure you do." She turned to Arthur. "Mr. Browne." Arthur stood. "Your Honor, the caveat rests on 3 independent grounds, each of which is sufficient on its own. 2 compromised witnesses, a filing irregularity that predates the issuance of the death certificate, and a notarized affidavit from the testator, himself expressing anticipatory concern about exactly the kind of alteration that appeared 17 days before his death." He paused. "Any one of these grounds warrants invalidation. Together they make the codicil indefensible." The courtroom was quiet. Judge Okafor picked up her pen and wrote something that took longer than anything she had written all morning. When she set it down, she looked at both sides of the aisle with the particular expression of a person who has already decided and is simply ensuring that what she says next will be unmistakable. The codicil dated June 18th, 2025. She said, is invalidated. The original will of Harold Calloway, dated and last amended in 2019, is reinstated as the governing testamentary document for this estate. She looked at Patrick Elmore. "Mr. Elmore, you will proceed with estate administration according to the terms of the original will. No further challenges to that document will be entertained without extraordinary cause." She looked at Caldwell. "The witness qualifications submitted by your office will be referred to the North Carolina State Bar for review. The court will also refer the matter of Garrett Collins's conduct to the appropriate licensing authority." She set her pen down a final time. "The codicil is invalidated." I heard Vanessa exhale. It was a small sound, barely audible, but the courtroom was quiet enough that it carried. I did not turn to look at her. I kept my eyes on the front of the room, on the bench, where Judge Okafor was closing her file, with the same deliberate care she had brought to opening it. Beside me, Arthur sat down slowly and folded his hands on the table. From the back row I heard the sound of footsteps, measured, unhurried. I turned then just in time to see Gloria walking toward the exit. She did not look at Vanessa. She did not look at me. She walked to the door, pushed it open, and left without a word. The door closed behind her with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Outside in the hallway, I leaned against the wall and let the building hold me up for a minute. Arthur came to stand beside me. He didn't say anything immediately, and I was glad for that. "Pop knew," I said finally. 2 years ago. He knew, and he couldn't say it out loud, so he wrote it down and locked it in a room where no one could touch it." "He knew you'd find it," Arthur said. I looked down at the floor. The marble was old and slightly uneven, worn smooth in the places where people had walked the same path for decades. I thought about my father on Beatty's Ford Road in September of 2023, sitting down at a table with a pen, writing out what he knew and what he feared and what he hoped, and then trusting it to a man with a small office and a broken elevator. He had not been afraid. He had been precise. I pushed off the wall and picked up my briefcase. There was still the matter of the promissory note, still the matter of the asset division, still the matter of what came next for all of us. But the codicil was gone, and for the first time since July, the estate belonged to the will my father had actually written. I arrived at the courthouse 40 minutes early. I had not slept. By 4 in the morning, I had given up pretending made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with a notebook open in front of me, 143 pages of names, dates, and conversations I had replayed until they wore grooves in my memory. At the end, I closed it and looked at the last page, the one I had left blank, with my father's question written at the top. What did you know, Pop, and when did you know it? In a few hours I was going to find out. Arthur was already at the courthouse when I came through security, standing near the window with his briefcase open reviewing documents, with the unhurried focus of a man who has learned that preparation matters more than anxiety. He looked up when I approached. How are you holding up? He asked. I'm here, I said. He walked me through the morning one final time. Patrick Elmore's full inventory had been submitted 3 days ahead of schedule. The motion regarding Gerald Pruitt's conflict of interest was in the judge's file. The only remaining variable was what Judge Okafor intended to do with the sealed envelope registered under file number MC-2023-4471. At 8:55, Vanessa walked in with Warren Caldwell and one associate. She was dressed in charcoal gray, more subdued than the preliminary hearing, as if she had recalibrated. She sat across the aisle without looking at me. Caldwell set his briefcase on the table and began reviewing documents performing competence for anyone watching. Gloria came in 2 minutes later and took the same seat in the back row she had occupied before, alone, hands folded in her lap. I knew her face the way you know the face of someone who has been in your life since before you had words for what a family was. She was afraid, and she was managing it carefully. I turned back to the front of the room and waited. Judge Sandra Okafor entered at 9:02. She moved to the bench without acknowledging the room's tension, opened her file, and set Harold's affidavit registration record on top of the stack. Before we proceed to arguments, she said, I want to address the sealed affidavit registered by Harold Calloway under file MC-2023-4471. She looked at both sides evenly. The document was notarized on September 14th, 2023, before 2 independent witnesses with no connection to the Calloway family. It was registered with written instructions that it be opened only upon filing of a formal legal contest. That contest has been filed and accepted. The condition has been met. She paused. The document will be opened now. She looked at Arthur. Mr. Browne, you are the registered custodian. Please bring it forward. Arthur rose, reached into his briefcase, and produced the envelope, cream-colored, sealed, with dark wax, stamped with a notary mark, my father's handwriting across the front. I had seen it once before in Arthur's office. It looked exactly the same. Nothing about it had changed. Only everything around it had. The clerk carried it to the bench. Judge Okafor examined the seal, confirmed the notary stamp and registration number for the record, and opened it with a letter opener from the desk drawer. The sound of the seal breaking was very small in a very quiet room. She read it to herself first. 4 minutes. I counted without meaning to. When she finished, she set it flat on the bench and looked up. I'm going to read this into the record, she said, in its entirety. My father's voice came back to me through someone else's reading, and it was the strangest thing I had experienced in a long time. Judge Okafor read the way she did everything steadily without performance, giving each word exactly the weight it had been written to carry. My father's words in her courtroom voice. Harold Calloway, delivered by a judge he had never met in a room he had never entered because he had trusted the right people with the right document at the right time. He began with his full name, his date of birth, his address on Beatty's Ford Road, and the date September 14th, 2023. He stated that he was of sound mind, that he had prepared the document without assistance from any family member, and that he had registered it with the court because he did not trust it would survive in any location where others had access. Then he wrote about Vanessa. He wrote that in the spring of 2021, his daughter had come to him in significant financial difficulty debt connected to her husband's business dealings. He had lent her $96,000. He had required a promissory note signed by Vanessa, in his presence notarized, due 90 days after his death. He stated clearly that he had not forgiven the debt and did not intend to. The original note was held with Arthur T. Browne. I heard Caldwell shift in his seat. He wrote about what he had observed beginning in early 2023. He did not name individuals. He wrote that certain members of his family had begun discussing his estate in terms that did not align with his documented intentions. Conversations that stopped when he entered a room, silences that told him more than the words that preceded them. He wrote, "A man learns to listen to what is not said." He wrote about his health. He acknowledged his clarity was declining and that he was preparing the affidavit specifically because he could not be certain of his capacity later. He wrote that any document purporting to alter his testamentary intentions, particularly one produced in the final months of his life, should be examined with great care by any court reviewing his estate. He wrote, I am writing this now because I do not know how well I will be able to write it later. He made no accusations beyond what he had directly observed. He named no villains. He stated only what he knew, what he had witnessed, and what he wanted preserved before the window of his clarity closed. The last paragraph was 3 sentences. Raymond has always done what was right, even when it cost him. I trust him to do what is right here. I am sorry I could not tell him more while I still had the words. The courtroom was silent. I looked at my hands in my lap and did not look up for a long time. The words were still in the air, suspended present, refusing to settle. I am sorry I could not tell him more while I still had the words. He had known. Sitting alone at his desk in September of 2023 with whatever clarity he had remaining, he had understood what was coming and had said nothing out loud to anyone except Arthur Browne and a sealed envelope. He had not confronted anyone. He had not warned anyone. He had simply written the truth down, locked it where no one could reach it, and trusted that it would find its way into the light when the time came. That was Harold Calloway. That had always been Harold Calloway. Across the aisle, Vanessa exhaled a small sound, barely audible, but the room was quiet enough that it carried the full weight of a person understanding that something she believed was settled had just come completely undone. She spoke quietly to Caldwell. He did not respond immediately. He was looking at his notes with the focused stillness of a man who is recalculating in real time. I turned to look at Gloria. She was staring at the floor directly in front of her shoes, hands still folded in her lap, face holding something I had never seen on it in 58 years of knowing her. It existed in the space between recognition and shame, the expression of a person who has just heard the voice of someone they wronged speak clearly from a distance they cannot close. Judge Okafor set the affidavit down. We will take a 15-minute recess, she said. When we return, I will hear arguments on the codicil's validity. She looked at Caldwell. Mr. Caldwell, I expect those arguments to account fully for the contents of this affidavit. Understood, Your Honor, he said. He did not look up from his notes when he said it. The gavel came down. The room began to move around me. I stayed still in the middle of it, in the particular stillness of a person who has just heard something that cannot be unheard, and is not yet ready to return to the ordinary motion of a room. My father had not been protecting the estate. He had been protecting me, and he had done it the only way Harold Calloway ever did anything quietly, precisely, and 2 years ahead of when anyone else would have thought to start. She called on a Saturday morning. I was in the backyard when the phone rang, raking leaves that had come down late from the oak tree, the same tree my father had planted when I was 9, the one I had watched go bare through the kitchen window in November. The work was simple and physical and required nothing from me except attention, which was exactly what I needed. I had spent the better part of a week inside my own head, and the rake and the cold air and the pile of leaves were a reasonable substitute for silence. I looked at the screen. Vanessa. I set the rake against the fence and answered. I'd like to see you, she said. In person, not with lawyers. I considered it for a moment. When? Today, if you're available. There's a diner on Central Avenue, the one near Cordelia Park. I used to go there with Mama. I knew the place. My mother had liked it too for the same reason most people liked it. It was unpretentious and consistent, the kind of establishment that had survived by simply being what it was without apology. 2 o'clock, I said. 2 o'clock, she repeated. Thank you, Ray. She had not called me Ray in a long time. She was already there when I arrived, sitting in a booth near the window with a cup of coffee she was holding with both hands, not drinking. She looked different than she had in the courtroom. The careful presentation was gone, the dark navy and the pearl earrings replaced by a gray sweater, and no jewelry at all. She looked closer to her actual age, which was something I had not noticed before because she had always been so deliberate about not letting it show. I sat across from her. The waitress came and I ordered coffee and we waited until she left before either of us spoke. I'm not here to argue, Vanessa said. I want you to know that first. All right, I said. She looked at her cup. I've spent the last week trying to figure out what to say to you. I wrote things down and crossed them out. I started 3 different versions of this conversation in my head on the drive over. She paused. In the end, I decided I'd just say what's true. That's usually the better approach, I said. She looked up at me, then directly for the first time since the hearing. I knew the original will existed. I knew what Daddy wanted. I told myself it wasn't fair that I had been there more than I had done. More that 30% wasn't a real reflection of what I had contributed. She stopped. I believed that. For a long time, I actually believed it. I didn't say anything. I let her continue. Derek's deal was in trouble before any of this started. The transaction, the property acquisition, he had already committed partners to it. He had told people it was as good as done. Her voice was steady but thin, like something being held at tension. When Daddy's health started declining, Derek started talking about timelines, about what the inheritance would cover, about how it would solve everything. She set her cup down. I let him talk. I didn't stop him. I told myself it was just planning. And Gloria, I asked. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. Gloria came to me first. Did you know that she called me in March before Daddy got significantly worse, and said she thought the will was unfair to both of us, that Daddy had always favored you? She paused. I knew that wasn't true, but I listened anyway. She looked at the table. Gloria found Garrett Collins. She arranged the visits. She told me Thomas Rourke was just a formality. A long pause. I signed where I was told to sign, and I told myself I wasn't doing anything wrong, because the document reflected what I thought I deserved. The diner was quiet around us, the low sound of other conversations, the occasional clink of dishes from the kitchen, the flat gray afternoon light coming through the window. Normal sounds, the sounds of a place that had no idea what the 2 people in the corner booth had been through. Vanessa, I said, why are you telling me this? She looked at me steadily. Because Daddy wrote in that affidavit that you always did what was right, even when it cost you. She paused. And I want you to know that I heard it. In that courtroom, when that judge read those words out loud, I heard them. I said nothing. I'm not asking you to reverse anything, she said. The offset stands. The distribution stands. I'm not here to negotiate. She wrapped both hands around her cup again. I'm here because I spent the last 5 months treating you like an obstacle instead of my father's son, and I think I know that Daddy would have wanted me to sit across from you and say that directly. I looked at her for a long moment. She was Harold Calloway's daughter, the same as I was his son. She had made choices I could not defend and had allowed herself to be guided by people who had used her debt and her pride as instruments. But she was sitting across from me in our mother's diner on a gray December Saturday, holding a cup of coffee with both hands, telling me the truth without being required to. I heard you, I said. It was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. It was something smaller and more honest than either of those things. An acknowledgement that the truth had been spoken and received, which is sometimes the most that 2 people can offer each other across the distance that a hard few months can build. She nodded once. We finished our coffee. She paid the check before I could, which surprised me, and we walked out together out into the cold December afternoon and stood on the sidewalk for a moment without speaking. Take care of yourself, I said. You too, Ray, she said. She walked to her car. I walked to mine. I sat behind the wheel for a long time before I started the engine, looking at nothing through the windshield. My father had trusted me to do what was right. I was beginning to understand that doing what was right and being at peace with it were 2 entirely different things, and that the distance between them was where the real work lived. The check from the estate arrived on a Thursday. Patrick Elmore's office sent it by certified mail, as he had said. It would be no ceremony, no phone call beforehand, just a standard envelope with the Mecklenburg County return address in the upper left corner, and my name written in the center with the particular care that professional correspondence tends to carry when the amount inside is significant. I signed for it at the door and brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table without opening it for a long time. I already knew the number. Patrick had walked me through it twice. Knowing a number and holding it in your hands are different things, and I had learned over the past 6 months that most of the important differences in life exist in that space between knowing and holding. When I finally opened the envelope, I looked at the check for a moment, then folded it in half and set it back on the table face down. I picked up the phone and called Arthur. It came, I said. Good, he said. How are you? It was the same question he had asked me in the hallway on the morning of the December 10th hearing, and I had given him the same answer I always gave when I didn't have a better one, but this time I thought about it before I responded. I think I'm getting there, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Your father would say that's the right speed. I smiled at that, which surprised me. It had been a while since anything had made me smile without effort. I drove to Beatty's Ford Road on a Friday afternoon 4 days before Christmas. The house was still in the estate's name while the final administrative details cleared. Patrick had said it would transfer formally in January. But the key was mine and the house was Harold Calloway's, and I had been avoiding it since July, in the way you avoid a place that holds too much of a person to enter casually. The front yard was quiet. The 2 oak trees my father had planted, one when I was 9, one when Vanessa was born, stood bare against the pale December sky, their branches dark and still. I had always thought of them as my father's trees, but standing there that afternoon, it occurred to me that he had planted them for us, one for each of his children. He had never said so. He had simply done it, and let the trees grow, and never mentioned what they meant. That was Harold Calloway. I let myself in through the front door. The house smelled the way it always had, a combination of old wood and the particular soap my father had used for 40 years, and something underneath both of those things that I could not name but recognized immediately as home. I stood in the entryway for a moment and let it settle around me. I walked through the rooms slowly. The living room with its bookshelves and the worn armchair by the window, where my father had done his crosswords every morning. The kitchen, where he had made the same pot of coffee at the same time every day for as long as I could remember. The small study where he kept his files, his correspondence, the careful paper record of a careful life. On the desk in the study there was a notepad, blank, a pen beside it capped on the way he always left it. I sat down in his chair. I thought about September of 2023. My father in this same chair at this same desk, writing the affidavit that would eventually be read aloud in a Charlotte courtroom by a judge who had never met him. Writing it in the clear knowledge that his clarity would not last, that the people around him were already measuring what he would leave behind, that the only thing he could control was the truth he put on paper before the window closed. He had not been afraid. He had been precise. I opened the desk drawer. Inside, beneath a rubber-banded stack of old utility receipts, was a small envelope I had not seen before. My name was on it in his handwriting, not the careful block letters of the affidavit, but his everyday script, the loose and slightly forward-leaning hand he used for grocery lists and birthday cards. I opened it. Inside was a single index card, 7 words written in pencil. The house is yours. Plant something. I sat with those 7 words for a long time. Outside the study window, the backyard was still and gray in the late December afternoon. The garden bed along the fence line had gone to dry stalks and bare soil. My father had kept it planted every spring for 30 years. Tomatoes and peppers, and once an ambitious attempt at squash that had not gone well. He had never asked anyone to help him with it. He had simply gone out every morning in the warm months and tended it and brought what it produced into the kitchen and cooked it without comment. I folded the index card and put it in my shirt pocket. On the drive home, I stopped at a hardware store on the way and stood in the garden section for a while, looking at the seed packets on the rack near the window. It was December, the wrong time of year to plant most things, but the right time to decide what you were going to plant when the ground was ready. I bought 3 packets, tomatoes, peppers, and one for a variety of climbing rose I had never grown before, that the picture on the packet showed blooming against a fence in a shade of deep red that looked in the fluorescent light of the hardware store, something like the color of the oak leaves in October before they fell. That night I sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of me. I had kept it since August, every date, every name, every call, every detail that had seemed important enough to record. 143 pages of the careful accounting of a hard 6 months. I read through the last few entries slowly, and then I closed it and held it in both hands for a moment. Clifford had called that afternoon briefly just to check in the way he had started doing every few days since the hearing. He said he was doing all right. He said he thought Harold would have been satisfied with how things had gone. I told him I thought so too, though satisfied was not quite the word I would have chosen. Grateful, maybe. and tired in the particular way that comes not from the loss of energy but from the expenditure of it on something that mattered. I set the notebook aside and left it on the table. I took the index card from my shirt pocket and laid it flat on the surface in front of me, smoothing it once with my thumb, the way you smooth a thing you want to keep. The house is yours. Plant something. My father had known me well enough to know that I would need a task, that doing what was right was not the same as knowing what to do next, and that the space between them needed to be filled with something concrete and growing and real. I turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. Outside, the oak tree in the yard stood in the dark, bare and patient the way things that are built to last tend to stand through the seasons they were not made for, waiting without apology for the ground to soften and the work to begin again. I've told you everything now, every name I wrote down. Every morning I sat at that kitchen table wondering if I was doing the right thing or just the stubborn thing. Here's what I believe: God doesn't always stop the wrong from happening, but he has a way of making sure the truth outlasts it. My father knew that. He sat down 2 years before any of this began, wrote out what he knew, sealed it, and trusted it to the right hands. That's not luck. That's faith in the long game. This is a story about Dad Revenge family, but not the kind you see coming. No speeches, no dramatic confrontations, just a father who prepared in silence and a son who refused to let that go to waste. That's what Dad Revenge family looks like when it's rooted in dignity. And if you've ever watched someone you loved get quietly pushed aside, you already understand what Dad Revenge family means at its core. Don't be like me. Don't wait until the documents are signed and the pressure is already at your door. Have the hard conversations now. Put the important things in writing now. Because family betrayal, revenge is a story nobody wants to live. The painful truth about family betrayal, revenge, is that it rarely begins with hatred. It begins with silence, with debt, with assumptions nobody said out loud. By the time it becomes family betrayal, revenge, it's already cost everyone something they can never get back. My honest opinion: the people who scare me most aren't those who act out of greed. They're the ones who convince themselves they deserve it. If this story stayed with you, drop it in the comments. Share it with someone who needs it. And if this kind of storytelling means something to you, the subscribe button is right there. It costs nothing, but means everything. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than I can say. One last note. Some stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted to reflect real human experiences. If that's not for you, no judgment. Find what fits. But if you're staying, I'm truly glad you're here. See you in the next one.